Joining us now for some reaction and talk about the state of the consumer, Elizabeth Renter, senior economist, NerdWallet. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let's talk a little bit about that Philly Fed data. That does seem to be a little bit concerning. It's the highest level since 2012. Excuse me. What does that say to you?
Hey, Diane, thanks for having me. Good morning. So about 11% of credit card balances are only seeing the minimum payment made each month. And the Philly Fed also reported that delinquencies on credit card accounts are rising. This reflects what we've seen already from the New York Fed and quarterly data, that delinquencies are rising. And so I think taken in a vacuum, looking at these numbers alone and looking at their most recent growth rates, could be alarming, but when you add additional context of debt pay downs during COVID, it does add some color to it that while it may be alarming for those households, certainly from a macroeconomic perspective, it's not necessarily flashing red lights yet.
So not flashing red lights. Is that also because the state of the job market is still holding up from your point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. We know on the aggregate, the consumer is strong, consumer spending is strong, and it's expected to stay that way going into this year. However, in our recent NerdWallet credit card debt report, we did find that about half or 48% of people that carry a credit card balance from month to month say part of that balance came from purchasing necessities. And purchasing necessities with a credit card by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. A lot of people do it to maximize points and rewards on their credit card. But if paired with that Philly Fed data, you're only making the minimum payment, it could go from, squeaking by to unmanageable fairly quickly.
To me, that sounds like they're not making enough money. They may have a job, but they're not earning enough. Is that one of the takeaways that makes sense in the context of your data?
That could be part of the issue. Another thing that could be part of the issue is, during the high inflation period that we most recently saw, wages weren't rising in those moments along with inflation. So as prices grew and during that catch-up period for wage growth, people may have relied on credit cards for things like necessities or ongoing expenses. And then once their wages began to catch up, they could have had difficulty getting ahead of that debt they accumulated during that initial price shock period.
So when you point out that you wouldn't necessarily be worried given the greater macroeconomic context, when does it start to become a yellow to a red flag?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess if the numbers continue to grow in this direction, I'm certainly paying attention to them, and if they continue to grow, I'll be paying more attention to them. I think you need to take into consideration the fact that during the first few years of COVID, we saw all of these numbers fall dramatically. So delinquency rates, balances, everybody took those opportunities with the economic impact payments and child tax credits to pay down their debt. So a lot of what we're seeing in the increase over the past year and a half, 2 years, is sort of a return to where things would have been without that additional savings, because I hesitate to say it's a return to normal, but those benefits that allowed us to pay down our debt were temporary.
Okay, those benefits were temporary. And then, Elizabeth, I got to ask you about the rise of BNPL. That's something that we don't have a lot of data on yet, and we don't know how much that is affecting households. Do you all have any insight into how much that is weighing on households, especially when you kind of compare it to credit cards?
You're right that it's difficult to find official data about buy now, pay later. Largely, we're looking at consumer sentiment data. And we do know that a lot of people are looking at buy now, pay later as an easy source of credit, right? It may not require the credit checks that a credit card does. And so we're seeing people that perhaps used to rely on payday loans or short-term lending turning to buy now, pay later. And like payday loans and short-term lending, oftentimes if you're unable to keep up with these payments, it can get out of control fairly quickly.
Okay. Out of control fairly quickly. And I know NerdWallet often gives a lot of advice. I know you're an economist. What's the top 3 tips that you all typically give consumers when they're dealing with credit cards that are getting out of control?
Yeah, I think the first step, no matter who you are, would be to contact the issuer. And this can be a tough phone call to make. It can be stressful. But keep in mind, the worst that can happen is they don't help you, right? The best that could happen is they could adjust your payment due date. They might even be willing to work with you on bringing your interest rate down slightly. The second tip would be, if your credit is still in good standing, look at a balance transfer credit card. That's going to give you an interest-free period where you can really attack the balance on your credit card without that interest working against you. And if your credit isn't in good shape, if those delinquencies or problems have already started to count against you, look into a nonprofit credit counseling firm. They can help get you into a debt management plan that can reduce those monthly payments and help you get ahead in that way.
All right, great insight along with some great advice. Elizabeth Renter, senior economist, NerdWallet. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.